My name is Carly Benson. I'm a 35-year-old Green Beret officer. Well, I was. Now, to some people, I'm just the woman who stood silent in a courtroom while my own brother tried to strip me of everything I had left: my honor, my identity, my freedom. But what they didn't see coming was the moment 12 Special Forces soldiers dressed in full combat gear burst through the courtroom doors and saluted me. What they didn't know was that the crazy veteran they tried to lock away had brought with her a sealed envelope that would flip the entire room upside down. This isn't a story about revenge through rage. It's about the slow, deliberate burn of justice served cold, built on every insult, every betrayal, every night. I cried alone after war, both on the battlefield and at home. Before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you watching from and how old are you? Please subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories so you don't miss more stories that hit where it hurts and heals. The courtroom was too quiet. That kind of silence that doesn't soothe, it stalks. I sat straight on the witness stand, my hands folded tightly in my lap, the veins on the back of them raised like cords. Across from me stood my brother Julian, wearing a Tom Ford suit, like it was armor. He looked every bit the polished family man, his posture perfect, his tie sharp, his voice calm as he addressed the judge. "My sister, Your Honor," he began, his tone saturated with grief, so theatrical it nearly made me laugh, "has lost her grip on reality." And just like that, the entire room tilted. In one sentence, he tried to erase everything I had built: my rank, my record, my reputation. He stood there painting me as a broken thing damaged by war and trauma, someone in need of protection from herself, from him. He didn't stop there. The clerk queued up a video on the screen. Grainy footage appeared me alone in the woods at night, pacing slowly, lips, moving hands clasped. Julian's voice narrated over the image like a documentary. "She does this for hours, talking to ghosts." He paused. "She's haunted." "It's tragic." I wanted to scream. He didn't tell the judge it was the anniversary of Corporal Santiago's death, that I was performing a ritual I'd done for years, whispering the names of the fallen so they wouldn't vanish into silence. That moment, my deepest grief had been twisted into an exhibit of madness. Serafina, his wife, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. No tears, just performance. A perfect supporting actress. Then came the psychological report, thick and damning, dropped onto the judge's bench like a coffin lid. Borderline personality disorder, delusions, paranoia. Signed by a doctor I had never even met. My mind didn't spin. It froze. It calcified. I watched the judge scan the pages, watched his expression shift from disinterest to doubt. And suddenly everyone was looking at me differently. Not as Major Benson, as a problem. A liability, a woman too fragile to hold her own life in her hands. Then he asked Ms. Benson, "Do you have anything to say?" And the truth is, I didn't. Not yet. My words would come later like thunder after the flash. But in that moment, all I did was meet my brother's eyes. He looked at me with that smug, quiet confidence of a man who thought he had finally won. And I said nothing. Because silence, real silence, isn't weakness. It's strategy. And in that courtroom, I wasn't pleading for mercy. I was watching the trap snap shut. Have you ever sat in a room where everyone thought you were crazy just because it was more convenient than facing the truth? What would you do if the people who should have protected you stood up and called you broken? They say childhood shapes you, but in my case it carved me up into two separate pieces, the shadow and the spotlight. Julian was the sun, the golden boy, the miracle child whose name practically echoed through the halls of our home like a hymn. Every trophy he brought home was displayed like sacred treasure. His little league medal center of the mantle, his acceptance letter to UNC framed and hung above the family phone like a holy relic. When he wrecked Dad's truck, boys will be boys. When he failed a test, that teacher always had it out for him. He was coated in layers of excuses, praise, and grace. And me, I was the utility child. Not unloved, just unimportant. I learned early that my role was to orbit his brilliance. My achievements weren't ignored, they were simply inconvenient. I remember the day I brought home a perfect report card in middle school. Straight A's. I placed it in front of my father like it was gold. He glanced at it, nodded once, and muttered, "Good." Keep it up before going back to his newspaper. No smile, no pride. Just another task completed. When I hit the game-winning shot at my high school basketball championship, my mother's only response was, "Be careful. Don't get hurt. You still have chores tomorrow." I didn't even bother showing her the game ball I'd been given. The refrain that defined my place was simple. "You're the girl, Carly. Let your brother shine. One day you'll need him." But I didn't want to need Julian. I wanted to be seen on my own. That desire, that quiet resistance built inside me like pressure beneath the skin. I wasn't angry back then, not yet. I was just numb, like a ghost walking the same hallway as the living. Seen, but never truly noticed. One Thanksgiving stands out like a wound. The house smelled of cinnamon turkey and sweet potatoes. Laughter danced from the living room, and the game buzzed on the TV. My dad stood and tapped his glass. To Julian, he said, proudly announcing my brother's acceptance to college. Then he pulled out a key and handed him a used but spotless Ford Mustang. The family erupted in applause. Champagne was poured. Julian looked like a king crowned in our dining room. After the celebration, I quietly retrieved the medal I'd won at the state science fair, first place over 300 students. I held it out, hoping for a flicker of recognition. Dad looked at it, nodded vaguely, and placed it beside a dirty napkin. "That's nice, honey," he said. "But things like that won't help you find a husband. Now go help your mother with the dishes." That was the moment I realized something. I wasn't going to wait for their praise. I was going to build my own worth without their permission. But I wonder, how many of you out there have ever felt like a stranger in your own family? How many of you have buried your victories in silence because they didn't fit the narrative they wrote for you? The day I told my family I was enlisting in the Army wasn't just a declaration, it was a detonation. We were sitting around the same old dinner table, the one that had heard more praise for Julian's mediocre test scores than for anything I'd ever accomplished. I'd rehearsed my words, carefully choosing a moment between courses. "I've made a decision," I said, my voice steady. "I'm joining the military. I want to try for special forces." For a second, it was like the air got sucked out of the room. My mother's fork clattered onto her plate. My father froze mid-chew. Julian leaned back in his chair, that smug smile already curling at the corners of his mouth. My mother was the first to speak. "That's no place for a nice girl," she gasped, already on the edge of tears. "Why would you want to do something so dangerous?" My father slammed his palm down, rattling the glasses. "You're embarrassing this family, Carly. What will people think?" But it wasn't their shock that cut the deepest. It was Julian. He waited until they left the table, then pulled me aside in the hallway. His voice dropped smooth and venomous. "What do you think you're doing, Rambo?" He sneered. "You're not built for this. You'll fail, and when you do, don't come crawling back. I won't pick you up." That was his promise, and I took it as a vow to prove him wrong. I didn't want his rescue. I wanted his silence. I left that house the next day with nothing but a duffel bag and a will forged from every moment they told me I wasn't enough. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just walked away. But as I did, one question kept echoing through my mind, like the sound of boots on concrete. If I didn't belong to them, then where did I belong? The answer wasn't in some cozy dorm room or corporate office. It was in hell. Specifically in the mud, sweat, and chaos of Robin Sage Special Forces final selection. I was one of only a handful of women to even attempt it, and I knew exactly what they were thinking when I showed up. She won't last a week. But I didn't show up to be liked. I showed up to survive. And I did. Every cut on my hand, every bruise on my ribs, every blister on my feet was a badge they couldn't take from me. I didn't tell anyone back home. Why would I? They wouldn't understand. They'd call it a phase. They'd ask if I was lonely, if I missed Julian. No. What I missed was feeling like I mattered. And for the first time in my life, I was starting to feel it. So let me ask you, have you ever made a choice so bold, so unrecognizable to your family, that it felt like betrayal to them, but salvation to you, Robin Sage, didn't break me? It tried. Believe me, it tried. 80 pounds on my back through dense, swampy forest in the dead of night with humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. Blisters tore through my boots like fire. Sleep was a luxury I hadn't earned, and food was a memory. But I wasn't there to be comfortable. I was there to prove that I was more than Julian's forgotten sister, more than my father's disappointment, more than the girl my mother said needed to stay pretty to survive. I was there to burn the life they had written for me to the ground. The instructors didn't go easy on me. They never said it aloud, but I saw it in their eyes. Doubt, waiting for me to crack. One of them used to say, "The forest reveals truth." He wasn't wrong. It peeled away every layer until only your will remained. And still the hardest battles weren't the terrain, the cold, or the fatigue, it was the ghosts I carried on my back. One in particular spoke the loudest, Julian. I'd hear his voice in the wind sneering, "You'll fail. Just wait." One afternoon during land nav, a teammate, a tall guy from California, probably twice my size, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Benson, this isn't the place for you. Go home. Cook something." He wasn't joking. He genuinely thought that was where I belonged. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just adjusted my grip on the compass and walked away. Silence is power. Let them underestimate you. Let them write you off. It makes the punch land harder when you prove them wrong. Later that night, we got lost completely off course. The sky had clouded over, hiding the stars. People panicked, argued, blamed. But I stayed still. I crouched near a moss-covered tree, listening, smelling, tracking the terrain like I was born in it. I recalculated our position using nothing but instinct and training. Then I stood and said, "Follow me." No one argued. Not this time. I led them out of the dark and back to the rendezvous point just as the sun broke through the trees. When we got there, no one said thank you. No one clapped. But the same guy who told me to go home, he looked at me and nodded. Just once. And that nod meant more than any praise my family ever gave me. That was the moment I realized I didn't need to scream to be heard. I didn't need to fight to prove I belonged. I just needed to endure. Let my actions be louder than their doubts. I wonder, have you ever had to earn respect in a place where no one believed you deserved it? Have you ever let silence speak the words they refused to hear? It was in the dirt, the sweat, and the silence of deployment that I found something I didn't know I was missing: family. Not the kind that shares your blood, the kind that shares your burden. We were stationed at a remote outpost in northern Syria, surrounded by dust and danger, cut off from the world. That place, bare bones, no comfort, no fanfare, became home. And in that home, I met Corporal Leo Santiago. He was a young kid from Texas, big-hearted, always smiling, always cracking jokes no matter how bad the day had been. He had this way of reminding you what you were fighting for when everything felt like it was falling apart. Leo and I weren't just comrades. We were something deeper. He reminded me of who I was when the war got too loud. On my 33rd birthday, we were running low on rations. Half the base was dealing with the aftermath of a mortar attack, and no one had slept in 3 days. I expected the day to pass unnoticed, just another rotation under the same choking sun. But that night, they surprised me. My brothers. My real family. They'd scraped together flour from MRE packets, used jam from those little squeeze tubes, and somehow shaped it into something resembling a cake. For a candle, they stuck a .50 caliber casing upright in the center. The cake was dense, ugly, uneven, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. They sang loud off-key and completely terrible. I laughed until I cried. Leo handed me a smooth, flat rock he'd found on patrol. "Kinda looks like North Carolina," he said sheepishly. "Happy birthday, ma'am." I closed my hand around that rock, the weight of it grounding me in a way I can't explain. That stupid little rock was more thoughtful than anything I'd ever received back home. For the first time in my life, I belonged. These men didn't care about what my parents thought. They didn't see me as damaged or delicate. They saw me as one of them. Equal. Trusted. And in that brutal, unforgiving place, I realized something important. I had been chasing the wrong kind of family my whole life. It wasn't about who shared my last name. It was about who would take a bullet with you and laugh in the dirt afterward. But here's the part that still haunts me. Leo never made it home. He died in my arms, during an ambush, bleeding out from wounds we couldn't treat because we were low on trauma gauze. That same gauze I'd later learn had been stolen and sold off by someone I trusted, someone with my blood. But I didn't know that yet. That truth would come later. For now, I just held onto his rock and swore I'd never forget. Not him, not that night, not the feeling of finally being seen. Have you ever found your real family not in the people who raised you, but in the ones who stood beside you when the world fell apart? The letter came in the middle of a sandstorm. I'd just come off a 16-hour shift, still covered in dust, sweat, and whatever grime northern Syria decided to throw at us that day. My name had been called during mail drop, rare, almost never happened, and when I saw the envelope, my chest tightened. The handwriting was familiar. Julian's, slanted, confident, a little too elegant for a man who never knew how to get his hands dirty. I sat on the edge of my cot, my fingers hesitating at the seal. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally reached out because he saw me. Because he missed me. Because somewhere deep down, he remembered I was his sister. The first paragraph was polite, detached. "Hope you're well. The weather here has been unpredictable." It read like a stranger writing out of obligation. Then came the shift, the real reason for the letter. "I have a friend interested in investing in reconstruction overseas," he wrote. "Do you happen to know which supply routes are safest or which contractors are most trustworthy?" At the time, I didn't see the trap. I was too tired, too starved for connection. I answered him, thoughtlessly, willingly. I offered up details about secure transport corridors, about regions less volatile, about the few local contractors who hadn't cut corners. It felt good for a moment to be useful to him. Like I finally had value in his eyes. But looking back, that was the moment I handed him the first weapon he'd use against me. I had no idea I wasn't helping a friend. I was feeding a predator. He wasn't curious. He wasn't trying to reconnect. He was building something quietly, methodically. I folded the letter and kept it with me, tucked between pages of an old field manual. A relic. I should have burned it. The months rolled on. Deployments changed. People rotated. But that letter stayed with me. I didn't know yet what he'd done with the information, but the fact that he asked in such a roundabout way should have set off alarms. I was trained to detect manipulation, misdirection, hidden motives. But when it came to Julian, I was blind. Maybe because part of me still wanted a brother. Maybe because the little girl inside me still hoped one day he'd say, "I'm proud of you." Instead, he saw my uniform, my rank, my security clearance, and saw opportunity. And that's what cuts the deepest. It wasn't just betrayal. It was calculated, strategic, cold. He didn't just want to steal from the government. He wanted to use me as the key. Have you ever given something out of love only to realize it was used to destroy you later? When was the last time someone you trusted twisted your kindness into their weapon? The invitation came like a peace offering wrapped in silk. After I'd returned stateside and was slowly adjusting to civilian life again, Serafina called. Her voice was warm, sugary, almost sisterly. "Carly," she said, "you've been through so much. I found someone who might be able to help. He's not one of those cold, clinical types, just someone to talk to. Would you be open to meeting him just for coffee?" I hesitated. My gut tensed, but my loneliness was louder. The nights had grown quieter, but not in a peaceful way. More like the kind of quiet that echoes too long. I hadn't spoken to anyone who truly knew me in months, and she made it sound so gentle, so harmless. Coffee. We met at a Starbucks near Chapel Hill. I arrived early wearing a simple blue blouse, my hair pulled back tight. I'd trained for combat zones, not for casual therapy chats. He arrived right on time. Mid-40s, clean-cut, soft-spoken. No clipboard, no lab coat. Just a warm smile and a paper cup. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. I nodded. His questions were easy at first, background deployment, the usual. Then came the shift. "Tell me about the transition. What's been the hardest part?" I told him. I opened up. Slowly at first, then all at once. About Leo. About the dreams. About how sometimes I woke up with my fist clenched around nothing but air, expecting to be back under fire. About how the silence of civilian life was sometimes more deafening than the battlefield. He nodded, listening with what seemed like deep empathy. At one point, he even said, "That must have taken incredible strength." I remember feeling for the first time in a while understood. Seen. I poured out everything. My grief, my guilt, my struggle to fit back into a world that moved on without me. I told him things I hadn't told anyone else. And when we finished, he thanked me for my honesty, said he'd follow up with some resources. We parted with a handshake. What I didn't see, what I never saw, was the small black recording device resting beside his phone, disguised like a second charger. He never told me our conversation was being documented, never warned me that my rawest, most vulnerable moments would become Exhibit A in a legal ambush I didn't even know was being planned. I walked away from that coffee shop lighter, thinking maybe I was finally healing. Meanwhile, he walked away, holding a weapon. Weeks later, I'd find out that everything I said had been edited, recontextualized, framed as instability. My honesty, my pain would be twisted to support a psychiatric narrative Julian and Serafina were already scripting behind closed doors. I thought I'd found a safe space. Instead, I stepped into a trap. I wonder, have you ever trusted someone so fully only to learn later that their compassion was rehearsed? What would you do if your deepest truths were twisted into lies and used to declare you unfit to live your own life? The envelope was thick, the kind that only ever brings bad news. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked into my mailbox between grocery flyers and a coupon for a tire rotation. The return address was from a law office in Raleigh. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, like somehow I already knew what waited inside. And I did. I just didn't want to admit it. Inside was a petition for guardianship, filed by Julian and Serafina Vance. My own family. The people who sent care packages with organic trail mix and said they understood what I'd been through. The people who said I was strong were now asking the state to declare me legally incompetent. Stapled behind the cover letter was the psychiatric evaluation. Not the one I recognized. Not from any doctor I had ever seen. This one was from a high-end clinic in Cary, dripping with credentials, and completely fabricated. It was Exhibit A. Page after page of clinical language delusions, paranoia, emotional dysregulation. There was no mention of context. No mention of trauma. Just a cold, damning diagnosis penned by someone who never even looked me in the eye. The signature at the bottom was neat, professional, and completely fraudulent. My hands trembled as I flipped through the remaining pages. The language was clinical but brutal. It painted me as unstable, incapable, a danger to myself. They weren't just challenging my mental health. They were trying to legally erase me. If this petition succeeded, I wouldn't be able to control my bank account, my medical decisions, my career, my freedom. Everything I had bled for every night I fought off the ghosts of war would be handed over to the man who once told me I'd crawl home a failure. It wasn't about care, it was about control. I dropped the papers onto the kitchen table and sat down. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest like I was back in an ambush zone. But this wasn't war. This was family. And it cut deeper than any battlefield wound ever had. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to disappear me. Then, like a cue written in some sick script, my phone rang. Julian's name lit up the screen. I answered. His voice was calm, cold, casual. You got the papers then? No apology, no shame, just business. Just sign the waiver, Carly, he said. Make this easy. Think of it as me helping you. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so grotesque it didn't feel real. Helping me. You're not well, he insisted. You need someone to look after you. I said one word. One small, solid word that felt like granite in my mouth. No. His mask shattered. The monster underneath came roaring out. You're nothing but a broken soldier, he screamed. You should be on your knees thanking me. And then he hung up. Just like that. No pretense left. Just the truth of who he really was. Have you ever heard someone you love drop the act and finally say what they truly think of you? How do you come back from that moment when the lie dies and all that's left is war? After the phone call, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't smash anything against the wall like you see in movies. I just stood there in the center of my small apartment, surrounded by silence, so heavy it felt like a weight on my chest. The papers were still on the table. The words still burned in my mind. Broken soldier. Pathetic burden. Those weren't just insults, they were weapons. Weapons aimed straight at the core of who I was. I'd survived IED blasts, ambushes in the dark nights where I held bleeding men in my arms, praying for medevac. But this betrayal, this assault on my sanity, it was a different kind of war. And I was done playing defense. I turned to the mantel above the unused fireplace. Folded neatly inside a wooden case was the American flag that had covered Leo Santiago's casket. I opened it slowly, letting my fingers drift across the stars. Leo died upholding the same oath I took, one I still carried in my marrow. To support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And suddenly it hit me. This wasn't just about inheritance or family drama. Julian was no longer just a selfish brother. He was a domestic threat. Not just to me, but to everything I'd sworn to protect. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. Cold, crystalline clarity. Like the kind that comes right before a firefight. The confusion was gone. The self-doubt gone. Replaced by a steady hum of purpose. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't dialed in years, Colonel Anna Sharma. She had been my superior once, back when I was stationed with SOCOM in Tampa. She was sharp, unflinching, and trusted me like few others ever had. When she answered, I didn't hesitate. Colonel, this is Major Carly Benson, I said. I believe my credentials have been compromised by a civilian with access to SOCOM-linked systems. I have reason to believe this person is committing defense contract fraud using my name. Her pause was brief, but I could hear the shift in her tone instantly. I understand, Major, she replied, crisp and focused. Send everything through secure channels. Do not speak to anyone else. We'll handle it. We'll handle it. Those words anchored me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. I wasn't some broken vet spiraling in an apartment. I was a soldier on a mission. My kitchen table became a command center. Laptops, printouts, military records. Coffee gone cold in chipped mugs. I barely slept. I didn't need to. I was back in the fight. Julian thought he could gaslight me into silence. He thought his words would make me doubt my own memory, my mind, my worth. But he forgot who I was. He forgot what I'd survived. And he definitely forgot who trained me. You see, I didn't need to raise my voice to win. I just needed to raise the truth. Have you ever had that moment when pain finally turned into purpose? When someone pushed you so far that you stopped defending and started fighting back? The truth wasn't just buried, it was bleeding. I spent nights hunched over my laptop, every muscle in my body, tense eyes stinging from fatigue, but I kept going. With the help of a cyber forensics team assigned quietly by Colonel Sharma, we began peeling back the layers of Julian's carefully crafted empire. And that's when we found it. An access log showing that my credentials, my secure SOCOM credentials, had been used on a specific date to authorize a last-minute diversion of critical trauma supplies. The date hit me like a round to the chest. It was the same day Leo Santiago bled out in my arms in that godforsaken outpost. The shipment we were supposed to receive, tourniquets, quick-clock gauze burn wraps, it had never arrived. At first, I thought it was a logistical error. It happens in war zones. Things go missing. Routes change. But now I saw the manifest. I saw my name forged on the authorization form. I saw the delivery rerouted to a civilian contractor, one of Julian's shell companies. That was the moment everything snapped into place. He didn't just steal money. He didn't just abuse my trust. His greed helped kill one of the only men I'd ever truly considered family. And for what profit I printed the document. My hands were shaking, but not with grief, with purpose. I knew then that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Not just for me, for Leo. For every soldier who'd ever relied on that shipment, every medic who'd run dry while someone's life slipped through their fingers. I opened a secure folder and compiled everything: the falsified psychiatric report, the financial transactions, the military shipping logs, the IP trace linking back to Julian's penthouse in Raleigh. Then I added a personal note. I wrote Leo's name, in bold, at the top of the first page, so no one would forget. That was the night I stopped being Julian's sister. I stopped being the forgotten daughter. I became a soldier on the front lines of a different kind of war, a war against erasure, manipulation, and greed. I sealed the manila envelope, pressed the red evidence tape firmly across the flap, and looked at it for a long time. Inside wasn't just proof. It was everything I had left. My service, my voice, my truth. But even as I prepared to deliver that truth into a courtroom, part of me grieved. Not just for Leo, not just for the men we lost, but for the girl I used to be, the one who just wanted her brother's approval. The one who thought family meant safety. That girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman forged from betrayal and battlefields. I wasn't seeking redemption anymore. I was seeking reckoning. Have you ever uncovered something so horrifying, so personal, that it changed the way you saw everything that came before it? When was the last time you realized the real enemy wasn't outside your walls but living within them? Courtrooms have a scent. It's not something you forget. Old wood polish, stale coffee, and the quiet breath of judgment hanging in the air. I walked into that courtroom not as a victim, not as the mentally unstable woman they had painted me to be, but as a soldier prepared for her final mission. I wore a navy suit, clean lines, crisp collar, no adornments. Civilian armor. I carried a leather briefcase. Inside it was the truth organized by section-numbered, cross-referenced. The weight of it pulled on my shoulder, but it was comforting. It was real. And I had built it myself, piece by piece, like assembling a weapon under pressure. Julian stood at the front of the courtroom like he owned it. His lawyer, slick and smirking, had already begun laying the foundation. She's unwell. She's struggling. My client is acting purely out of love and responsibility. Every word made my stomach turn, but I remained still. My silence unnerved them. They were expecting an outburst, a meltdown. The kind of scene they could point to and say, "See, she's not stable." but all they got was stillness. The judge, a man in his 60s with deep lines around his mouth from decades of forced neutrality, watched me carefully. He flipped through the psychiatric report, the edited transcript of my therapy coffee session, and the video of me in the woods. His face remained unreadable, but I knew that look. It was the same one commanders wore when deciding whether a mission was worth the risk. Then came the motion. Julian's lawyer straightened his tie, and with a tone soaked in rehearsed compassion said, "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a woman in crisis. My client isn't trying to harm her. He's trying to protect her. We request a summary judgment today for her sake." He gestured toward me like I was a broken thing too fragile to speak. The judge turned to me. His voice softened. "Miss Benson, this is your final opportunity. Do you wish to respond?" I didn't blink. I didn't hesitate. Instead, I calmly unlatched my briefcase. The metal clicked like the cocking of a rifle. I pulled out the sealed manila envelope, heavy and thick, and slid it across the table to the bailiff. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "I do." That was all. He opened it. The first page was a financial summary. The second, a shipping manifest. The third, an official letter bearing the seal of the United States Special Operations Command. I watched the shift happen in real time. His fingers stopped tapping. His expression dropped the mask. And then he read. Faster. Deeper. His jaw tightened. And finally he looked up, not at me, but at Julian. The temperature in the room changed. You could feel it, like the sudden stillness before thunder rolls. Julian shifted in his seat. For the first time, his confidence cracked. Because he knew this wasn't pity on paper anymore. This was fire. Have you ever watched someone realize they're no longer in control? Not because you yelled louder, but because you came armed with the truth. The silence didn't last long. The judge slammed his gavel down with a force that startled even the bailiff. Court is in recess. Bailiff locked the doors. No one enters, no one leaves. A beat later, the heavy courtroom doors burst open, not with chaos, but with precision. 12 Green Berets dressed in full operational gear marched in with lethal calm. Not one of them looked at the gallery, not at the lawyers, not even at the judge. They moved in tight formation and stood directly behind me, a wall of discipline and truth like a second spine. At the center, Major Kalen Rohr stepped forward, his presence undeniable. He approached the bench, offered a sharp salute, and turned to face Julian. "Julian Vance," he said, his voice like steel drawn across gravel. "You are being detained by order of the Department of Defense and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for violations of the False Claims Act, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." The words echoed in the chamber like a war drum. Julian froze. All the color drained from his face. He tried to speak, but his mouth moved without sound like a man suddenly underwater. His lawyer jumped to his feet, sputtering. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This is a stunt." But the judge didn't flinch. His hands rested firmly on the bench. "I've seen enough," he said. "This court recognizes the evidence submitted by Major Benson as material to ongoing federal investigation. Mr. Vance, you will not be leaving this courtroom as a free man today." 2 military police officers stepped forward. One read Julian his Miranda rights in a monotone voice. The other gripped his arms and pulled them behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was sharp, precise, and final. It was the sound of justice closing its fist. Serafina gasped. Her hand flew to her chest, her face crumbling like porcelain dropped from a great height. Her world, built on manipulation, appearances, and carefully curated lies, had just shattered in front of an audience. Julian turned to me as they began to escort him away. His eyes met mine, full of disbelief and desperation, like he still didn't understand how he had lost control of the narrative. He had always believed himself the author of my story, but today I held the pen. The last time you called me your little sister, I said my voice even and steady. You were lying then, too. He blinked. No comeback, no smug remark, just silence. For once, the man who had twisted my past, mocked my pain, and nearly ruined my life had nothing left to say. And that silence, that was mine. That was victory. Have you ever experienced justice so clear, so undeniable that it didn't need applause, it only needed silence? After Julian was led away, the courtroom fell into a stunned, echoing stillness. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the air felt different, heavier, like it had witnessed something it wasn't supposed to. Serafina had collapsed into her seat, her manicured fingers, trembling mascara streaked beneath her eyes for the first time without intent. Her posture, once perfectly poised, now crumpled beneath the weight of a truth she couldn't polish away. But I didn't look at her. I didn't watch Julian disappear in cuffs either. I simply stood turned to Major Roar and the 12 warriors behind me and gave them a single nod of gratitude. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Final. I walked out of that courtroom alone. The double doors closed behind me with a soft thud, not the kind that echoes, but the kind that ends chapters. I stepped into the sunlight, but I didn't feel triumphant. There was no music swelling in my chest, no rush of adrenaline or glee. Just a strange emptiness, vast and unfamiliar, like a battlefield after the last shot has been fired. I had won. But victory doesn't always feel like a parade. Sometimes it feels like a funeral for who you used to be. I got into my car and started driving with no destination. Just east. Past the towns and traffic through the pine-lined back roads until the scent of pine needles turned to salt and sea. I ended up on Emerald Isle where the Atlantic lapped at the shore like it was trying to soothe something. I took off my shoes, walked barefoot into the damp sand, and sat facing the waves. The ocean didn't ask me anything. It didn't offer praise. It just kept moving, pulling and releasing like breath. That night, I watched the sun sink behind the horizon, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. A week later, my lawyer mailed me the final documents. The deed to the house was officially back in my name. Along with it came a smaller envelope, cream-colored stationery, my name written in elegant cursive I recognized instantly. Serafina. I braced myself. I expected manipulation, maybe even apology. But what I found was something worse. A letter so spineless, so drenched in self-pity, it read like a eulogy for her reputation. Julian deceived us all, she wrote. I didn't know the extent of what he was doing. I thought I was protecting the family. I hope one day you can forgive him. And me. She didn't ask for my forgiveness. She expected it. Like it was a formality. Like my story was just another mess she could organize into neat little lines. I folded the letter once, twice, and dropped it in the trash. No drama, no final speech, just closure. Have you ever realized that some people don't regret what they did to you? They only regret that it didn't work. A few days after I discarded Serafina's letter, my phone rang. Unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I should have. But something in me, a leftover reflex from years of being trained to respond to assess, made me pick up. Her voice came through thick with manufactured sobs, so rehearsed it almost made me laugh. Carly, please, she whimpered. I need to talk to you for the children. They keep asking about their uncle. They don't understand what happened. He made a mistake, but he's your brother. Her voice cracked in all the right places like a polished performance built for sympathy. I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. I wanted to hear what she thought would work, what angles she would try next. Because when someone's mask falls, sometimes they still scramble to pick it back up before anyone notices the face beneath. She went on telling me about the stress, the media attention, the emotional toll. She never once mentioned what they did to me, only what this whole mess had done to her. It wasn't guilt. It was inconvenience. And I realized something right then: she didn't miss me. She missed control. Julian was gone, and with him, the story they'd crafted so carefully was unraveling. Without their shared narrative of helping the broken soldier, there was nothing left to anchor them to virtue. When she finally paused, breathless from her monologue, I took a deep breath. Not because I was angry, anger had long burned out, but because I needed to say the words clearly, without emotion, the way a surgeon handles a scalpel. "Serafina," I said quietly, "you are no longer a part of my family. Do not ever call me again." And then I hung up. I didn't wait for her reaction. I didn't need to hear another tearless sob or plea for redemption dressed in pearls. I blocked the number and set my phone down. I had drawn the final line. That moment wasn't hatred. It was self-preservation. Because forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. And I didn't owe them either. I had survived war zones with less psychological warfare than what they tried to do to me in broad daylight. What they called love was manipulation. What they labeled care was calculated control. And what they destroyed, trust, truth, belonging, was not something they ever intended to repair. I wasn't going to wait for an apology that would never come. I wasn't going to pretend that just because we shared DNA, we shared values. I stood by the window of my apartment, watching the last light of evening stretch across the rooftops. For the first time, the silence inside didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Have you ever had to choose peace over family? Not because you wanted to, but because staying connected would have cost you your sanity. I went back to the house, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity. The house at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the one I had once called home. It had sat in my memory like a scar, something I avoided touching for fear it would still sting. But now, with the deed back in my name, and the last threads of family severed, I needed to face it. Closure doesn't come in the courtroom. It comes in quiet places long after the noise has faded. The gravel crunched under my boots as I pulled into the driveway. A newer family had lived there since the sale, but they were gone now. The yard was overgrown, the shutters sun-bleached the air around it, heavy with old ghosts. I stood there for a long while, keys in hand, before I walked away. I wasn't going inside. I wasn't rebuilding a life on a foundation cracked by years of neglect. That place had never been a home. It had been a stage where I was cast as the understudy in Julian's show. I had no interest in stepping back into that role. Instead, I bought land just a few miles up the ridge. Unclaimed quiet surrounded by trees that didn't care who I was or where I'd been. I started small. One cabin, then another, then a main lodge. I didn't call it a retreat. I called it the Overwatch Outpost, built by a soldier for soldiers. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't a program. It was a place where no one had to explain themselves. No one had to retell their trauma for someone else's understanding. You didn't have to speak unless you wanted to. You didn't have to relive anything to justify your silence. The only requirement was that you respected the peace and the pain of others. Every day I worked the land with my hands. I dug fences, planted gardens, repaired things that broke. I watched the sun rise and set, not from behind a screen or through a windshield, but with my boots planted firmly in the dirt. My back ached, my hands grew calloused, and my heart. It finally stopped racing. There was something holy in the stillness, something sacred in the simplicity. I didn't need to be a major here. I didn't need a rank or a title. I just needed to show up, breathe, build, heal. One evening, as I was stacking firewood for the first winter, I looked out over the cabins. A small group of vets sat by the fire pit, mugs of coffee in hand, their faces lit by the flames. No one was talking. No one needed to. They were home. So was I. Have you ever had to burn something to the ground, not out of rage, but to clear space for something better? What would you build if you stopped waiting for permission and finally chose yourself? The idea for the podcast came to me one night, during a storm. The rain beat hard against the tin roof of the main cabin, the kind of rain that makes you sit still and listen. I was alone in the common room, sipping from a chipped mug wrapped in a wool blanket that still smelled faintly of pine. I had no plan, no outline. Just a small mic, an old laptop, and a room that echoed too much when I wasn't speaking. I called it the watch. Not because I was guarding anything anymore, but because I knew what it felt like to be on the edge waiting for someone to see you. That first night, I didn't script a thing. I just spoke. I talked about what it means to be told that your pain is imaginary. About how sanity is often defined by the people who fear your truth. I spoke about Leo, about betrayal, about the long road home that doesn't always lead to your front door. I didn't try to sound polished. I didn't care if my voice cracked. I just wanted to speak plainly, honestly, like a human being who had survived too much to pretend anymore. By morning, the inbox was full. I hadn't advertised it. I hadn't posted anywhere. But the message found its way to the people who needed it. Veterans from Vietnam, from Iraq, from Afghanistan. Women, men, some who had never told a soul about what haunted them. They wrote to say, "Thank you. You said what I couldn't." Others shared their own stories, raw and unfiltered. A former Navy corpsman wrote, "You reminded me I wasn't crazy for breaking down in Walmart. The sound of a dropped can sent me into a flashback." But no one ever explained that was normal for us. The podcast became more than my voice. It became theirs. A chorus of truth. Each episode I'd read letters with permission or share fragments of my journey. I didn't offer advice. I offered solidarity. There's a power in simply hearing someone say, "I've been there, and I'm still here." We weren't broken. We were carrying things civilians were never meant to understand. And that didn't make us weak. It made us warriors of a different kind. At the Overwatch outpost, vets began to arrive not just for rest, but to reconnect. They didn't come for answers. They came for the fire pit conversations, the early morning hikes, the chance to sit beside someone who knew the silence they carried. And slowly, day by day, we all began to stitch ourselves back together. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to stand. Enough to feel like we weren't alone in the dark. Have you ever realized that your greatest wound might be someone else's lifeline? That your survival isn't just for you, but for the person listening? Still lost, still hoping someone out there understands. One morning, just before sunrise, I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of tea in hand. The air was crisp, still carrying the last breath of night. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood quiet in the distance, their silhouette painted in gentle hues of lavender and pale gold. I sat down in the old rocking chair that creaked like an old friend with secrets. As the steam curled from my cup, I heard the soft crunch of boots on gravel. A young Marine, early 30s, tall, tightly wound, walked across the yard and paused at the edge of the porch. He had been staying at the outpost for 6 days. Until now, he hadn't said more than a few words to anyone. Always kept his head down. Always sat just a little apart from the others. He looked at me, then pointed to the wooden plaque I'd mounted over the cabin door. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil," it read. Psalm 23. My anchor in the darkest places. He cleared his throat and said, "I've been in that valley, Major." His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a while. But I think I'm finally on the other side. I didn't respond right away. I just nodded and motioned to the empty chair beside me. He sat. We didn't speak again for a long time. We didn't need to. In the stillness, I thought about how far I'd come. From that witness stand where my own brother tried to erase me to this porch where strangers who had seen hell could finally exhale. This place wasn't built to fix people. It was built to hold space. Space for grief. For memory. For laughter that didn't feel guilty and tears that didn't need explanation. We didn't force healing here. We let it happen like moss growing on stone, slow, soft, unspoken. Some nights after everyone turned in, I'd walk the trail that circled the property. I'd look up at the stars, and for a moment I'd feel like I was back on deployment, scanning the horizon, listening for the unspoken. But now that same silence brought peace, not tension. Out here, no one asked for my resume, my rank, or my trauma. They just showed up. And that was enough. The Marine beside me sipped his coffee and looked out toward the mountains. "It's quiet here," he murmured. I smiled. "Yeah," I said. "That's the point." We sat there as the sun began to rise, light filtering through the trees like a promise kept. There were no medals to earn, no battles to fight. Just breath, presence, and belonging. Have you ever discovered that the place you were searching for wasn't a destination, but a feeling? And once you found it, did you finally allow yourself to rest? The longer I stayed at the outpost, the more I realized healing didn't come in a grand moment. It arrived in fragments. Quiet glances, shared coffee, a hand on a shoulder. Sometimes it came in the form of someone simply staying for dinner. Other times it was someone finally sleeping through the night without reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. I kept a journal, not a formal one, just notes scribbled in the margins of receipts, backs of envelopes, scraps of napkins. Little observations. A phrase someone said. The way the fire cracked differently on cold nights. One entry read, "He laughed today. First time I've seen his teeth." That was about Mike, a former Army medic who hadn't smiled in months. Another said she planted basil in the window box. Said it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. That was Tanya, who came from the Navy, who still flinched at helicopters overhead. People arrived with invisible bags over their shoulders, some heavy with guilt, others filled with silence so thick it choked them. They didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen. I didn't try to be anyone's counselor. I listened when asked. I made breakfast when I could. I built benches along the trails for those who needed to sit mid-walk and breathe. And slowly the outpost took on a soul of its own. The walls held stories that weren't told out loud. The soil remembered footsteps of those who once felt unworthy to walk on it. And then came the day I received a letter. Handwritten. The kind you hold carefully, not because it's fragile, but because it feels like something sacred. It was from Leo's younger sister, Maria. She'd heard about the outpost, heard about what we were building. She wanted to visit. Not to accuse, not to reopen wounds, but to see the place where her brother's memory still lived. When she arrived, I showed her the small stone garden beneath the pine trees, where I'd placed that smooth rock he gave me shaped like North Carolina. His name was etched into a flat wooden marker. No rank, no medals, just Leo and the date he died. She stood there quietly for a while, then whispered, "Thank you for remembering him like this." That night she joined us for dinner. Simple food, baked bread, chicken stew, a table of mismatched chairs and mismatched people. But it felt like communion. When she left, she hugged me, tight, no words, just shared breath. I stood on the porch after she drove off, the stars blinking awake above me. And I realized this wasn't just my mission anymore. It was Leo's legacy. It was everyone's. Have you ever held onto someone's memory so fiercely that it guided you to a new purpose? When grief softened just enough to become a compass, did you follow where it led? It was early spring when we hosted our first gathering at the outpost. Not a ceremony, not a press event. Just a quiet weekend for anyone who had written into the podcast, anyone who had said, "I don't know where else to go." Word had spread beyond. Veterans, spouses, children, even a few retired nurses who had worked in field hospitals showed up. There were no name tags, no schedules. Just coffee always brewing, stew on the stove, and chairs arranged in wide circles, so no one felt like they were being watched. The air was filled with pine smoke and a sense of shared gravity. No one said it aloud, but we all knew why we were there. We weren't here to escape the past. We were here to survive it together. I met a man named Curtis, a Vietnam vet with deep lines in his face and hands that trembled when he poured coffee. He wore his trauma like an old coat, tattered but familiar. We sat on the porch for an hour, not speaking. When he finally spoke, he didn't start with a story. He asked me if I had ever watched a bird hit a window. "It flies full speed," he said, thinking it's clear sky. Then bam, falls to the ground. Most people think it's dead, but sometimes if you leave it alone, just let it be. It gets back up, flies again. He looked at me. "That's what this place feels like." I didn't respond. I just nodded and made sure his coffee stayed warm. Later that night, we built a bonfire near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't for storytelling. It was for presence. People sat with blankets over their shoulders, mugs in hand, staring into the flames like they held answers. Occasionally, someone would speak one sentence, a memory, a name. And when they did, no one interrupted. No one tried to fix it. We just listened. And in the stillness between their words, there was a kind of holiness. Not religious, not ritualized, just honest. Near midnight, a woman named Denise, an Air Force widow, told us about the day the knock came on her door. She didn't cry. She just spoke. Steady. Clear. When she finished, she looked around and said, "I haven't said his name out loud in 8 years. I leaned forward and gently asked, "Would you say it again?" She did. And the entire circle repeated it after her. Not in unison, not like a chant, but like an offering. One name carried 12 times around a fire. That moment became a tradition at the outpost. At every gathering we speak names. No titles, no ranks, just names. Because in remembering them as people, not roles, we honor who they really were. Sons, daughters, brothers, friends, human. Have you ever witnessed silence so full of love, so anchored in respect that it felt more powerful than any speech? When was the last time you gave someone space not to speak perfectly, but simply to be heard? Not long after that bonfire, I recorded an episode of The Watch that was different. It wasn't about military stories or betrayal. It was about legacy. I sat in the small, soundproofed room off the main cabin microphone, warm beneath my fingertips, and asked a single question. What are we leaving behind? I spoke slowly, deliberately, because I knew this wasn't just for the veterans anymore. This was for the sons and daughters growing up in the shadows of silence. For the spouses who never got a welcome home ceremony. For the caregivers, the survivors, the quiet warriors who stood beside us without ever being recognized. I wanted to say thank you, but more than that, I wanted to say you were seen. That episode triggered something I hadn't expected. Letters came not just from soldiers, but from civilians, nurses, teachers, even a retired postmaster in Ohio who wrote, "I never served, but I've spent 40 years watching broken men come home and never say a word. Thank you for saying it for them." A woman from Texas sent me a small leather-bound Bible. Inside the cover, she'd written, "You didn't just survive. You built something holy." I didn't feel holy. I felt humbled. Every day at the outpost, I watched people rebuild themselves quietly, painfully, honestly. Not because I had a plan, but because I had made space. And that space became sacred because it was honest. There were no slogans here. No flags waving in the wind. Just a gravel path, a rocking chair, a fire that never truly went out. One morning, I stepped outside with my tea and found a new stone in the memorial garden. I hadn't placed it. It was smooth, small, the size of a palm. On it, someone had carved the word, "Still." No name, no date. Just that one word. I stood there for a long time, letting it settle into me. Because that's what we were all doing here. Still healing. Still remembering. Still choosing to live. Julian tried to take my story. He tried to define me with lies, to erase my voice through paperwork and pity. But in the end, all he did was push me to find my real purpose. He took my family, but gave me a much larger one in return. He gave me clarity. He taught me what silence costs and why it must be broken. I don't need revenge. I have something better, peace. And it wasn't given. It was earned. Have you ever found that the greatest justice isn't what you take back, but what you build in the ashes of what was taken? If this story taught me anything, it's that sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who wound you deepest. But their betrayal doesn't define you, your response does. To anyone who's ever been dismissed, erased, or called broken, you're not alone, and you're not finished. Sometimes you don't get justice in the courtroom. Sometimes you build it with your bare hands, brick by brick, memory by memory. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you had to walk away from blood in order to find peace? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story moved you, like it, subscribe, and share. Someone out there needs to know they're not alone. Thank you for listening.